You're watching a Highwire Media podcast.
Happy holidays and welcome to a special holiday edition of Cold Case Friday. Today's episode, we're covering another infamous cold case. Before we dive into the story, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, NordVPN. You all know NordVPN is my go-to service for online privacy and security. Their high-speed VPN ensures that your personal information stays safe and protected whenever you're browsing, streaming, or shopping online. Honestly, the peace of mind it gives me while protecting my data is unmatched. I also love how easy it is to use, whether I'm on my laptop, phone, or tablet. I can connect to one of their thousands of servers worldwide in just one click. Plus, it helps me access content from different countries, which is a total game changer for streaming. I literally don't know how I ever lived without it. NordVPN is also committed to protecting your privacy. They never log your data, and they use the best encryption technology available, which is something I can appreciate. If you're interested in trying out NordVPN, I promise it's worth it. Check out the link in the description. And with that, let's get into today's episode. Today, we're unraveling the mysterious and haunting case of the Sodder family, a case that even decades later continues to baffle investigators, researchers, and true crime enthusiasts. At the heart of the story are George and Jenny Sodder, a hard-working Italian immigrant couple and their large family of 10 children. Their seemingly idyllic life in a small West Virginia town were upended one fateful Christmas Eve in 1945, leading to one of the most perplexing mysteries in American history. George Sodder, born in 1895, hailed from Tula, a small village on the Italian island of Sardinia. At just 13 years old, he left his homeland for the United States in 1908. Traveling with his older brother. Like millions of other immigrants, George arrived at Ellis Island, the gateway to a new life in America. However, shortly after their arrival, his brother decided to return to Italy, leaving young George to navigate this foreign country completely on his own. It was a daunting situation for a boy at his age, but George's determination and resilience would ultimately define his life. George quickly found work with the Pennsylvania railroads, performing tough physical labor by carrying water and supplies for their crews. It wasn't glamorous work, but provided him with the opportunity to build a foundation in his new country. After a few years of this, George moved to Smithers, West Virginia, where his entrepreneurial spirit began to shine. He first worked as a driver transporting goods, but he didn't stop there. George saved up and launched his own trucking company, hauling dirt for construction projects, freight, and coal, a critical industry in the region. His work ethic and determination quickly earned him respect in his community. It was during his time in Smithers that George met Jenny Cipriani, a young woman working at the family store. Jenny's family had also immigrated from Italy when she was just 3 years old, and like George, she understood the struggles of building a new life in America. The two hit it off immediately, bonded by their shared heritage and values. Their connection was strong, and before long, they married and started building a family together. The couple eventually settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a small, quiet town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. Fayetteville was a close-knit community with a population of only about 1,300 people by 1945. The Sodders built a 2-story timber frame house just over 3 kilometers outside of town and began their family. Between 1923 and 1943, George and Jenny welcomed 10 children into their lives, creating a household that was full of love, laughter, and hard work. Fayetteville may have been small, but it had a strong and active Italian-American community which made it feel like home for immigrant families like the Sodders. However, small towns often come with small-town dynamics, where gossip and rumors spread faster than facts. For the Sodders, this would later complicate their search for answers when tragedy struck. The Sodders were considered a well-respected, middle-class family within the Fayetteville community. George's trucking business was successful and the family enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle at the time. They were admired by their hard work and devotion to their children. However, despite their status as a prominent family, not everyone in the community shared warm feelings toward the Sodders. While George was respected as a businessman and community member, he was also known for his outspokenness. He wasn't afraid to voice his opinions on topics like business practices, current events, and politics. Most notably, George was highly critical of Benito Mussolini, the leader of Italy's National Fascist Party. Mussolini had been a controversial figure in Italy, and his rule had divided Italians at home and abroad. Even though Mussolini had been deposed and executed in 1944, George's anti-Mussolini sentiments didn't set well with some members of Fayetteville's Italian community, many of whom were still loyal to the former dictator, or held more sympathetic views towards his regime. George made no effort to hide his disdain, and this often led to heated arguments with others in the community. George's opinions were so strong that he gained a reputation for being stubborn and unwavering, which occasionally put him at odds with his neighbors. This tension simmered beneath the surface, creating an undercurrent of animosity that might not have seemed significant at the time, but would later become a focal point of an investigation into what happened to his family. By 1945, George and Jenny were raising their 10 children in their two-story home outside of Fayetteville. The children ranged in age from 23 to 2 years old, and their household was a lively one. Despite the challenges of managing such a large family, the Sodders appeared to be a happy, close-knit unit. George continued to work hard at his trucking business, and Jenny managed the home, keeping everything running smoothly. That year, like many American families, the Sodders were eagerly anticipating the end of World War II. Their eldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military, and the family hoped he would return home safely. Despite the war's challenges, the Sodders seemed to have built a good life for themselves, but beneath the surface, a series of unsettling events began to unfold in the months leading up to Christmas Eve. Events that, when pieced together later, would suggest that something sinister was brewing. In the months leading up to Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder family experienced a series of unsettling and peculiar events that, at the time, seemed strange but not necessarily alarming. However, when viewed in hindsight after the tragedy, these incidents take on a much more ominous and foreboding tone, suggesting that the family may have been targeted. One of the most chilling incidents involved a traveling insurance salesman who visited George Sodder at his home. The salesman was there to pitch a life insurance policy for George and his family. George, known for his straightforward and sometimes stubborn nature, declined the offer. However, instead of taking the rejection politely, the salesman's demeanor shifted dramatically. He became angry and aggressive, delivering a disturbing and threatening warning to George. Quote, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." The man spat. He added, ominously, "You are going to pay for the dirty remarks you've been saying about Mussolini." George, who was accustomed by defending his outspoken anti-Mussolini views, dismissed the salesman's outburst as nothing more than the ravings of a bitter and angry man. However, after the fire, the threat would stand out as one of the most alarming red flags in the case. At the time, George had no idea that this seemingly minor confrontation could have been connected to something much darker. Not long after that encounter with the salesman, another strange incident occurred. A man came to the Sodder home under the pretense of looking for work. George, who was often willing to lend a hand or provide odd jobs to those in need, spoke with the man briefly. However, during the conversation, the man's attention seemed unusually focused on the Sodder house itself, specifically the fuse boxes at the back of the home. The man pointed at the fuse boxes and said, "Something unsettling. These are going to cause a fire someday." George thought the comment was odd, especially since the house's electrical wiring had recently been inspected and given a clean bill of health after the installation of a new stove. The electrical system had been deemed completely safe by a professional. Still, George shrugged off the man's remarks, assuming it was an innocent observation. If not an entirely accurate one, but after the fire, this cryptic comment would resurface in George and Jenny's mind, making them question whether the man's visit was more than it seemed. Around the same time, one of George's older children noticed a suspicious car parked along U.S. Highway 21, which ran near the Sodder family home. The car, described as unfamiliar and out of place, was seen parked in the same spot on multiple occasions. Even stranger, the people inside the car appeared to be watching the Sodder children as they returned home from school. Each day, as the young Sodder children got off the school bus and walked towards the house, people in the car would sit and watch them intently. At the time, the family dismissed it as odd but didn't consider it to be an immediate threat. However, in the aftermath of the fire, this strange behavior began to feel deeply sinister. Who were these people? Why were they watching the children so closely? Did they have a connection to what would happen later? In the weeks before the fire, another peculiar and unexplained incident occurred. The family began experiencing issues with their telephone line. On at least one occasion, George reported that their phone line appeared to have been tampered with. The family chalked it up to faulty service or normal wear and tear at the time. But after the events of Christmas Eve, the phone line's condition would become a key piece of evidence. This incident would later tie into the night of the fire itself, when the family discovered that their phone line had been deliberately cut. Excuse me. This, along with other strange occurrences, painted a picture of something deliberate, an act of sabotage or premeditated interference that hint at a larger, more sinister plan. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the Sodders were completely unaware of just how connected these strange events might be. Taken individually, they seem like unrelated oddities: an angry salesman, a strange comment from a passing worker, a mysterious car, and some phone issues. Nothing felt explicitly threatening at the time. However, after the fire, George and Jenny couldn't help but piece these moments together, suspecting that they were warning signs of something far more sinister. What's perhaps most unsettling is that these incidents all involve some level of targeted behavior towards the Sodders and their home. Whether it was the threatening remarks about Mussolini, the focus on the fuse box, or the deliberate surveillance of their children, these incidents hinted at the possibility that the Sodder family was being watched, and possibly even targeted, long before the night of the fire. As George and Jenny began to reflect on these events after the tragedy, they couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been planning something against them. George's outspoken nature, particularly his vocal criticism of Mussolini, may have made him enemies within the Italian-American community. Could these incidents have been orchestrated by people angry with George over his political views? Or was there another motive entirely, one rooted in jealousy, revenge, or even something criminal like extortion? While the Sodders didn't have definitive answers, the accumulation of these strange occurrences created an undeniable sense of foreboding. Something wasn't right, and the fire that would destroy their home and take the lives of their 5 children didn't feel like a random tragedy. It felt intentional. Christmas Eve should have been a joyful and magical night for the Sodder family. The home was filled with the warmth and excitement of the holiday season. George and Jenny, along with 9 of their 10 children, were gathered in their 2-story home just outside Fayetteville, West Virginia. The family spent the evening celebrating together, exchanging small gifts, and enjoying the special time with one another. Their eldest son, Joe, was not home that night as he was serving in the Army during World War II. But the rest of the family made sure to make the evening festive for their younger siblings. The house was alive with laughter, chatter, and the palpable excitement that comes with Christmas. For the younger children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, the anticipation of Santa Claus and Christmas morning made it nearly impossible to sleep. Even Jenny and George's older children, John, George Jr., Marion, and the youngest 2-year-old, Sylvia, shared in the excitement, though they also looked forward to getting some rest after a long day. The night began with a surprise from the Sodder family's oldest daughter, Marion. She had recently started working at a local dime store, and with her earnings, she had purchased toys for her 3 younger sisters. When she arrived home that evening, she handed them their gifts, much to their delight. The younger girls were thrilled, and their excitement filled the house. They played with their new toys late into the evening, their energy still buzzing despite it being bedtime. As the clock ticked closer to 10:30 p.m., George and Jenny were ready to call it a night. The couple was understandably tired after a long day. With Christmas morning fast approaching, they wanted to get some sleep before the excitement of the next day began. The younger children, however, begged to stay up a little longer to enjoy the festive mood. Feeling the holiday spirit, Jenny allowed them to stay up, but she made them promise to complete a few chores before heading to bed. She instructed them to feed the cow, check the chicken coop, close the curtains, turn off the lights, lock the front door before going to bed. With that, George, Jenny, and their youngest daughter, Sylvia, went to bed on the first floor, while their 4 older children, John, George Jr., Marion, and Sylvia, headed upstairs to their bedrooms. The 5 younger children remained downstairs, happily playing together and basking in the excitement of the season. By midnight, the house had fallen mostly quiet. The younger children had finished their chores and climbed up to the attic, where they all shared a bedroom. Jenny and George were sound asleep in the bedroom on the first floor, with Sylvia tucked into a bed near them. Marion had dozed off on the living room couch, exhausted after a long shift at work earlier that day. But shortly after midnight at 12:30 a.m., the tranquility of the night was interrupted by an unexpected and unusual event. The telephone rang. Startled awake, Jenny got out of bed and went to answer the phone, which was located in the downstairs hallway. On the other end of the line, she heard the voice of a woman she didn't recognize. The woman asked for someone by a name unfamiliar to Jenny. In the background, Jenny could hear the faint sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and a festive atmosphere. Jenny politely told the woman she must have the wrong number, but before Jenny could hang up, the woman let out a strange, quick laugh that Jenny later described as unsettling. Without saying anything further, the woman hung up, leaving Jenny confused and slightly uneasy. She placed the receiver back on the hook and headed back towards her bedroom. On her way back to bed, Jenny noticed that the house wasn't quite as she'd left it. Despite instructing the younger children to turn off the lights, close the curtain, and lock the front door, Jenny realized these chores had been left undone. The lights in the living room and kitchen were still on, the curtains were wide open, and the front door was locked. Jenny wasn't angry. After all, it was Christmas, and the children had likely been too excited to remember everything. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and locked the door herself before heading back to her bedroom. On the couch, she saw Marion asleep, but she assumed the younger children had already gone up to the attic, as was their usual routine. Satisfied that everything was now in order, she returned to bed. Jenny had barely settled back under the covers when another strange occurrence startled her. At approximately 1 a.m., she was woken again, this time by a loud thud on the roof, followed by a rolling sound almost as if something had been thrown onto the house and rolled down. The sound was strange but brief, and after a moment of listening, Jenny didn't hear anything further. Convinced it was nothing urgent, she drifted back to sleep. However, in hindsight, this sound would take on a much more sinister significance. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Jenny woke for the third time, but this time it wasn't a sound that roused her. Instead, it was a sharp, acrid smell. As she became more alert, she realized what it was. Smoke. Panic set in immediately. Jenny sat upright and noticed smoke beginning to seep into their bedroom from beneath the door. He quickly woke George, and the two sprang into action. Jenny grabbed Sylvia while George began yelling for the rest of the family to get out of the house. The situation escalated quickly as the smoke thickened and flames became visible, roaring through parts of the house. Jenny and George were able to escape the burning house along with Sylvia, Marion, and their two older sons, John and George Jr. Once outside, the family did a quick head count. It was then they realized the horrifying truth. The 5 youngest, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were missing. They had been sleeping in the attic and were now trapped inside the burning house. George immediately sprang into action, determined to save its trapped children. He ran to the side of the house to retrieve the ladder he always kept there, intending to climb up to the attic window and pull the children out. But to his shock, the ladder was missing. It had always been stored in the same spot, and now it was nowhere to be found. Desperate, George decided to use his coal trucks to drive closer to the house, hoping to climb on top of one to reach the attic. However, neither of the trucks, both of which had been working perfectly the day before, would start. George couldn't understand why both vehicles would suddenly fail. As flames engulfed the house, George made one last attempt to save his children by running to the well to collect water to extinguish the fire. The well was frozen solid, making it impossible to draw water. The situation was hopeless. All George and Jenny could do was stand outside in the freezing cold, watching helplessly as their home burned to the ground. They yelled and screamed for the children, begging them to jump from the windows or call out for help, but no cries or voices were ever heard. In less than an hour, the Sodder family home was reduced to ashes. The fire had burned with such ferocity and speed that it left nothing but smoldering rubble. George and Jenny, devastated and in shock, clung to the hope that their children had somehow escaped. But as the flames died down, the reality began to set in. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived. What the family didn't yet realize, however, was that this fire and the events surrounding it were only the beginning of a much larger, darker mystery. By dawn on Christmas morning, the fire had completely destroyed the Sodder family home, leaving behind only a pile of ashes and the skeletal remains of the basement. George and Jenny, along with their surviving children, stood outside in the bitter cold, devastated and horrified by what had just occurred. But there was no time to grieve. There were still 5 missing children unaccounted for. They held on to a sliver of hope that the children might somehow have escaped and fled the house. However, the more they searched, the more it appeared that something was terribly wrong. Despite the desperate situation, help was slow to arrive. Fayetteville's fire department was a small, volunteer-run operation. On that particular night, many of its members were either away for the holidays or serving in World War II. The fire station was located just 3 kilometers, or 2 miles away from the Sodder family. The Sodder home, I should say. The fire department didn't arrive until 8 a.m., nearly 7 hours after the fire started. The delay wasn't due to a lack of urgency from the Sodder family or their neighbors. When the fire was first discovered, George tried to call the fire department, but the phone line wasn't working. Jenny had just received a call earlier that night, so the line had been functional. Something must have happened to it. Desperation, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to use their phone, but they couldn't reach an operator. Another neighbor drove into town to alert Fire Chief F.J. Morris, who initiated Fayetteville's outdated phone tree system. In this system, one firefighter would call another, who would call another, and so on, which slowed down the response considerably. Adding to the chaos, Fire Chief Morris was unable to drive the fire truck himself, further delaying the department's arrival. By the time the firefighters finally reached the scene, it was far too late. The house had already burned to the ground, and the only thing left to do was sift through the ashes. Once the flames were extinguished, the firefighters, along with police, began searching through the wreckage for the remains of the 5 missing children. However, no bones, teeth, or human remains were found. This was a shocking and perplexing discovery. How could a fire so intense that it reduced the house to ashes leave no trace of the children's bodies? Adding to the mystery, Fire Chief Morris speculated that the fire had been so hot it had completely incinerated the bodies, leaving nothing behind. But this explanation didn't sit right with Jenny. She couldn't reconcile it with what she knew about fires and cremation. Bones, even after hours of exposure to heat, do not simply disintegrate. Jenny began speaking to local experts and even contacted a worker at a crematorium who confirmed her suspicions. The worker explained that even at temperatures of 1100 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures much higher than those of a typical house fire, bones remain. Cremation, which takes several hours at such high temperatures, still leaves behind fragments of bone. A house fire, which typically burns between 530 and 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, could not have been hot enough to completely destroy 5 bodies, especially in just 30 to 45 minutes. The time it took for the Sodder home to burn to the ground. Jenny conducted her own experiments at home to prove her theory. She burned animal bones from chickens, pigs, and cows in her wood stove. No matter how long she left the bones in the fire, they always remained identifiable, charred but still intact. Lack of remains at the fire deeply troubled her. Something wasn't adding up. Despite the unusual circumstances, the fire was quickly ruled an accident by local authorities. The official cause of the blaze was determined to be faulty wiring. The case was effectively closed. However, this explanation made little sense to George and Jenny. First, the Sodder's house had recently undergone an electrical inspection, and the wiring had been declared safe. The inspection had been conducted as part of the installation of a new stove, and no issues had been found at that time. Second, during the fire, Christmas lights on the house were still visible. If the fire had truly been caused by faulty wiring, power to the house would have been cut, and the lights would have gone out immediately. The Sodders couldn't shake the feeling that the fire had been deliberately set, and that the lack of remains suggested something far more sinister. They began to wonder, were there 5 missing children even in the house when the fire started? Several other troubling details began to emerge. George and Jenny vividly remembered the strange events that had occurred the moments leading up to and during the fire. First, the matter of the missing ladder. George always kept a ladder propped against the side of the house, but when he needed it that night, it was gone. The ladder was later found discarded in an embankment 20 meters or 65 feet from the house. Its removal seemed deliberate, as if someone had wanted to prevent George from reaching the attic. Then there were the coal trucks. George had tried to start one of the trucks to use it as a platform to climb to the attic, but neither truck would start, despite both having worked perfectly the day before. George suspected that someone had tampered with them to prevent him from using them in the emergency. Finally, there was the phone line. Initially, George believed it had been damaged in the fire. However, upon closer investigation, a telephone repairman determined that the line had been cut. This would have required someone to climb a 14-foot pole and reach several feet over to sever the wires, a deliberate act of sabotage. Another key piece of evidence came to light when 2-year-old Sylvia was playing near the site of the burned house a few days later. She found a strange object in the yard, something Jenny described as green rubber pineapple. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be an incendiary device, a type of object designed to start fires. This discovery gave new weight to the testimony of a local bus driver who came forward to say that he had seen fireballs being thrown onto the Sodder's house's roof on the night of the fire. The thud Jenny had heard on that night, followed by the rolling sound, now seemed to make sense. It was highly likely that someone had deliberately thrown an incendiary device onto their home, sparking the fire. As George and Jenny processed these details, their suspicions grew stronger. This fire had not been an accident, but the most troubling question of all remained unanswered. What happened to their 5 missing children? The fire wasn't hot enough to destroy the bones. Why were no remains found? Why had none of the children screamed for help or tried to escape? And if they weren't in the house, where were they? These haunting questions would drive George and Jenny to search for answers for the rest of their lives, even as strange new details and alleged sightings of their children began to emerge. Jenny sat up in bed as the smell of smoke became stronger. As rumors swirled, a local bus driver came forward with a chilling account. He claimed, like we mentioned, that on the night of the fire, he had been driving past the family home and saw fireballs being thrown onto the roof. This testimony matched something Jenny had noticed during the night. Additionally, like we said, telephone repairman inspected the phone line, concluded that it was deliberately cut. Later, 2 men, Lonnie Johnson and David Atkins, who owned a local beer store, were arrested for stealing items in the area, including the Sodder's ladder. They also admitted to cutting the phone line, claiming they had mistaken it for a power line. However, they denied any involvement in starting the fire or causing the children's disappearance. Lonnie was fined $25, and David avoided prosecution by joining the army. The Sodders, however, remained convinced that these strange events were connected. From the threats they had received, suspicious behaviors of strangers watching their home in the weeks leading up to the fire. As the weeks passed, they began to entertain an even darker possibility. Perhaps the children had been kidnapped and never actually perished in the fire. As George and Jenny replayed the events leading up to the fire and began considering all the strange occurrences, they started to believe their children had been kidnapped rather than dying in the fire. Several witnesses came forward with reports of seeing the children after the night of the fire, which further fueled this theory. One woman claimed she saw the fire from a distance and on the same night saw the children being driven away in a passing car. She remembered one of the children sticking their head out the car window. Another witness, a waitress at a rest stop 50 miles from the family home, reported serving breakfast to a group of children in the morning after the fire. He claimed the children were traveling with adults and the vehicle they arrived in had Florida license plates. A third witness, a woman working at a hotel in Charleston, West Virginia, hours drive from the Sodder home, said she recognized the children from their photos in the newspaper. She claimed they had stayed at her hotel about a week after the fire. According to her, the children were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian descent. She noted that the entire group acted strangely. When she tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, the adults became hostile. One of the men gave her a menacing look and started speaking rapidly in Italian to the other adults. After that, they all stopped speaking to her entirely. The group checked out early the next morning. These accounts deeply troubled George and Jenny. They were particularly convinced by the last witness's report and started to suspect that their children had been taken by members of the Italian mafia. George believed that someone in the mafia had tried to recruit him, and when he refused, they retaliated by kidnapping his children and setting the fire to the house as a cover-up. In 1947, 2 years after the fire, George came across a school photo in a New York newspaper that caught his attention. one of the girls in the photo looked strikingly similar to his youngest daughter, Betty, who would have been 7 years old at the time. Convinced it was her, George drove all the way to Manhattan to visit the school and speak to the girl's parents. However, the school and the parents refused to let him meet her. While this was likely a misunderstanding of the parents trying to protect their child, it left George even more determined to uncover the truth. That same year, George and Jenny sent a detailed letter to the FBI, explaining their suspicions that their children had been kidnapped. To their surprise, they received a personal message from the FBI's director, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover expressed sympathy for their situation and stated that the FBI would gladly investigate the case. Local authorities permitted it. However, when the Sodders approached the Fayetteville Police and Fire Department to request FBI assistance, their request was denied. The local authorities refused to let the FBI get involved, a decision that made George and Jenny even more suspicious. Why wouldn't they want the FBI's help? It didn't make sense. Frustration but determined, the Sodders hired a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, to dig deeper into the case. Tinsley uncovered some deeply unsettling information. First, he found out that the insurance salesman who had threatened George's house and family over his comments about Mussolini had served on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire was caused by faulty wiring. This raised serious questions about the objectivity of the investigation. Even more alarming, Tinsley discovered that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had made a bizarre confession to a local priest. According to the priest, Morris admitted that he had found a human heart in the ashes of the Sodder home, and he had placed it in a metal box, buried it at the site. Tinsley persuaded Morris to show him the box, which was dug up during the investigation. When the box was opened, however, it was revealed that the heart wasn't a human heart at all. It was a beef liver. Even more suspicious, the liver hadn't been exposed to fire or heat, meaning it had been planted there deliberately. Morris admitted that he had buried the liver in hopes that it would convince the Sodders to stop investigating the fire. The shocking revelation only strengthened George and Jenny's belief that there had been a cover-up. Why would the fire chief go to such lengths to mislead the family? In 1949, almost 4 years after the fire, George and Jenny hired a pathologist, Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, to conduct a more thorough excavation of the site. During this search, Dr. Hunter uncovered 4 small bones buried in the debris. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis, and their findings raised even more questions. The bones were identified as 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to a single individual. The Smithsonian concluded that the vertebrae came from a person aged 16 to 22. However, the oldest missing Sodder child, Maurice, was only 14 at the time. This ruled out the possibility that the bones belonged to him or any of the other missing children. Additionally, the bones showed no signs of charring and had not been exposed to fire, meaning they likely didn't originate from the Sodder home at all. The Smithsonian suggested that the bones had probably been planted there, either accidentally or intentionally. This discovery left the Sodders with more questions than answers. These bones don't belong to their children. Where were they? And who had placed these bones at the scene? In 1952, George and Jenny decided to take drastic action to keep their children's case in the public eye. They erected a billboard along Route 60 near the site of their home. The billboard featured photos of their 5 missing children and offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to their recovery. It became a local landmark and remained standing for 37 years. Over the years, George followed numerous leads and witness reports. For example, a witness in St. Louis claimed that one of the Sodder children, Martha, was living in a convent. A bartender in Texas overheard 2 men bragging about kidnapping the Sodder children. George saw a photo in a Florida family's home that he thought looked like his children. He drove all the way to confront them, only to be convinced that it wasn't them. In 1967, Jenny received a letter postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a man in his 30s who bore a striking resemblance to their son Louis. On the back of the photo were the words, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. A90132 or 35. The Sodders were convinced it was Louis and hired a private investigator to travel to Kentucky to investigate. However, the investigator disappeared and was never heard from again, taking the family's money with him. Some speculated that the numbers on the back of the photo could be a postcode from Palermo, Italy, suggesting that the children might have been taken there. Others believe the photo could have been part of a cruel prank. Still, George and Jenny believe it was a sign that Lewis was alive. They added the photo to the billboard and kept it framed on their mantle at home. George Sodder died in 1969 without ever knowing the fate of his children. In one of his final interviews, he told a reporter, quote, "Time is running out for us. We just want to know if they died in the fire. We want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." Jenny continued to wear black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, tending to the flower garden she had planted at the side of their home as a memorial to her lost children. She passed away in 1989, and the following year, the billboard was finally taken down after 37 years. The only surviving Sodder child, Sylvia, was just 2 years old at the time of the fire. Now in her 80s, she remains convinced that her siblings didn't die in the fire. Her earliest memories of that night: her father's bleeding arm, her family's screams, the side of their house in flames. Sylvia occasionally speaks to online sleuths and investigators in the hope of uncovering the truth about what really happened to her siblings. But with that, let me know your theories on what happened in the comments section below. And of course, give us a thumbs up if you like the video. Hit that subscribe button down below. Now you need a subscribe button. It's the one, says subscribe. Then you see that bell notification button right next to it. Hit that one too. Then you'll be notified of our future videos. Of course, if you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. As always, your support helps the channel grow, upgrade our equipment, bring new hosts, be able to pay them, and eventually one day take the show on the road. As always, we'd love to do live episodes from crime scenes from all over the country and possibly world. Your support can help make that happen. Of course, don't forget to subscribe to us on all major podcast platforms: Good Pods, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, everywhere you get your podcast from, you can find us there. Of course, as always, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Happy holidays.